Hello and welcome to your weekly briefing for Global Conflict 1. In this video I'll be covering days 130 to 136 and as usual doing my best to document the various political changes that have occurred within that time frame. So I think to start out, one of the things I'll be covering is the complete reversal of fates for House 15 in regards to their war with House 10. Now, if you recall last week, House 15 was struggling to sort of stem the tide that was House 10 when it came to their offensive launched against them. House 10 at the time was fighting both House 19 and House 15 and really holding out fairly well against House 19 and making progress against House 15. Things have changed a little bit, and while House 10 has made an admirable push into southern Mexico, they have been losing ground in their home countries here in South America. How does this happen for a house as big as House 10? Because House 10, they won the first round of the glory race, right? They had some of the best players in there. Well, it seems that in the past week, around 100 players might have actually dropped out of the house, and this could obviously decrease their overall strength, right? And another thing is there might be a certain element of despair going up against two very big alliances, especially considering that nobody really likes House 10 that much aside from House 17. I would like to mention that from the sources that I've heard from, it's possible that House 7 might even be interested in helping 15 against 10. Things look pretty bad for House 10. They don't have the allies that they need to win this war, and with players dropping out of the house, what you could either view that positively or negatively. If the players that dropped were simply the farmers in South America that really weren't contributing anything, that dead weight is probably best removed, because otherwise they only can serve as a liability to the house for invading forces who will easily jump on those players. So I'm not sure that losing 100 players in a week is actually a bad, I shouldn't say 100 players, losing approximately 100 players, probably less, within a week doesn't always have to be a bad thing. But given the rather alarming territory loss that House 10 has suffered in the past week, it could be indicative of something more pernicious. In addition to House 7 threatening House 10, I've also heard that House 2 sort of threw its weight around and demanded some land in Germany from House 10, with the threat of war if House 10 didn't comply. And apparently, according to the accounts, House 10 has complied with this demand and sort of saved itself from a war there, perhaps. What is interesting about this is, you know, that House 7 and House 2 are formerly one alliance, so it seems that a lot of sentiments towards outside alliances still run deep despite the fracture that has come about between those two former allies. Well, let's talk a little bit then about what went wrong for House 15. In the Middle East, you know, House 15 has been fighting House 1 for a very long time now. House 1 originally started in the Middle East, and they have fought rather heroically against outstanding odds in terms of numbers of players. Obviously, House 1 had a lot of good players in it, a lot of solid carding players, but at the same time they were vastly outnumbered, and it is only understandable that most players in a situation such as that would actually be rooting for the underdog. After House 11 and 10 went to war with House 15 and 18 and 4, Dave won, the House Marshal of House 1, before dropping. He dropped from House 1 and joined House 11, and has had House 11 assist in continuing the campaign against House 15 quite effectively. They have taken a couple more counties. So when it comes to 10, it really seems like everybody is sort of kicking them when they're down. House 19 is fighting them, House 15 is fighting them, House 7 has threatened them with war, House 2 has threatened them with war. Well, maybe House 7 hasn't threatened them yet, but there is word that they would be willing to engage in such a war. And it all might be for the best, because House 9, as you might recall, it has its hands full now. House 9 recently joined House 17 alliance as of last week, and two of their factions have since been either removed or kicked. You can just see what's the Codebreaker dropped house again. According to the accounts that I've heard, though, a faction named No Name was kicked by House 9. I'm not sure as to the reason of this, and in retaliation for being removed from the house, they went ahead and joined House 19. So that faction went from being allied to being an enemy. And then, of course, there was Made in Poland, who was just sort of goofing around the map. I really don't know what their mission statement is, but it has been made quite obvious that in the past they are good friends with Spartak and obviously wouldn't fight against them. So you may recall them being in House 9 last week. Well, that is no longer the case now with House 19 fighting House 9, and they have went ahead and joined House 19. But one of the most interesting things about this is how House 19 has really grown in the past couple of weeks since their war with House 15 and the House 2-7 alliance peace was made between those, and they are really emerging on the global stage as a threat again. Really, with House 15 distracting House 10 the way they are, most of the opposition to House 19 is going to be coming from House 17 and House 9, mostly just House 9 now. As you can see, there isn't a whole lot of House 17 left on the map, but the current prominent House 9 players are former House 17 members. The thing is, most players were quite hostile to the idea of House 19 winning, even the first glory round. So I'm wondering if this will bring the whole House 15, House 10 conflict to a brief conclusion, for them to focus once again on House 19. A lot of players in House 9, I think, would be happy if House 15 and 10 stopped bickering between themselves and assisted House 9 against 19. Otherwise, they're likely not going to be doing so well. As you can see, House 19 has pushed quite well into House 9's home territory. Well, it was former House 17, but in Australia, they have taken over an entire county quite efficiently. The majority of parishes by far are House 19. Lastly, the new House 12, because you may remember the former House 12 was allied with House 2 and House 7 before they broke up, but then it was taken over by some neutrals here in and around about the parts of central China. Apparently this hasn't panned out either, as the mastermind behind it all has gone inactive apparently, and most of the remaining active players that were in House 12 have since dropped and returned to being neutral. I don't know what the current status is of the players who are in House 12 and what their diplomacy is with other houses, but it might not be all that active of a house. I see a lot of the original, the golden, what have you factions are still in it. Okay, with all the news out of the way, let's take a look at country changes. So Greenland has flipped from House 7 to neutral. Mexico obviously has flipped from House 15 to House 9. Colombia in South America has flipped from House 10 to neutral. Spain has flipped from neutral to House 19. Italy has flipped from House 15 to House 10. And Romania has flipped from House 17 to House 19. On the county and province level, this county has flipped from House 15 to House 11. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that. Zambia has flipped from House 19 to House 10. South Sudan has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Tunisia has flipped from House 15 to House 10. Iraq has flipped from House 18 to House 11. North Saudi Arabia has flipped from House 18 to 11. Afghanistan has flipped from House 18 to House 11. Kashmir has flipped from neutral to House 10. Turkmenistan has flipped from House 19 to House 9. Bhutan has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Bangladesh has flipped from House 6 to House 1. Cambodia has flipped from House 17 to House 13. Thailand has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Myanmar has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Both of those, Thailand and Myanmar, that flip is in part due to the fact that Made in Poland joined House 19. Yunnan has flipped from House 20 to House 19. Qinghai has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Japan has flipped from House 13 to House 9. North Korea has flipped from House 15 to House 13. Papua has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Kalimantan has flipped from House 17 to House 19. Sulawesi has flipped from House 17 to House 19. Northern Territory in Australia has flipped from House 9 to House 19. South Mexico has flipped from House 15 to House 10. Cuba has flipped from house 15 to house 10. Paraguay has flipped from house 10 to house 15. And Uruguay has flipped from house 10 to house 15. That pretty much covers the changes that I've noted over the past week. As always, if you have information you believe would be of use in creating this report, I welcome you to get into contact with me. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week.
Stronghold Kingdoms. What will you fight for? Play now for free.